Welcome into Vandy on SI. I'm Joey Dwyer. He's Dylan Tovitz. We're both at home. Different backgrounds today, but still wanted to get something out. Too much happening this week in Vanderbilt athletics to not get something out. Dylan, we'll start just reflections on this weekend. One more time on the Diego Pavia magnum opus before we head into the week.
Yeah, for sure, Joey. It was a pretty remarkable game for Pavia and company on Saturday, and I think it was a win that Vanderbilt, desperately needed, which sounds kind of funny because obviously they've had so much success, but between the Texas loss and the Missouri game, which was very close and hard fought, and getting taken to overtime, 45 to 38, against an Auburn team that hadn't poured out any offensive success really. Vanderbilt needed a game like this to prove themselves both to the committee and in general as like, they could still completely pound a team, an SEC team that, by the way, has been pretty good the past month. So it was a really important win, and obviously Pavia's performance was probably the best we've seen, and it was a, you know, picture perfect way for him to go out like he did there. I mean, we talked a lot about this on Saturday, so I won't get too much into it, but it was a very NFL like game for Pavia, and even when he's had good games in the past, um, he's done it with his legs and he's done it with his mobility and his aggressiveness and his energy and everything. Like he had that on Saturday, but his rushing attack wasn't anything special. I think he went like 15 for 48 or something like that on the ground.
Mhm.
Um, he as a pocket passer, he developed so much, and that was a game that I think he'll look back on as or I think that anybody can look back on and see like how much he's grown and how much he's evolved over the past you know year and a half, and between the Richie Hoskins throw and the two deep balls to Trey Richardson and the fade to Junior Sherrill, it felt like he was consistently placing the ball in the perfect spot all day against, like I've talked about, a pretty solid Kentucky defense that allowed 10 points combined to Florida and Auburn in its two prior games. So it was a fantastic game for the offense, and as we talked about, the offensive line deserves a ton of credit for it. The wideouts, Trey Richardson, Junior Sherrill, deserve a ton of credit for it. But yeah, full offensive onslaught for Vanderbilt to beat Kentucky, and it sets them up this weekend for what's probably going to be another high-scoring game in Knoxville, Joey.
Definitely. And I'm looking at it and I'm saying they've got to have a high offensive output to have any chance on Saturday. I think Clark comments about the defense returning to form, I think were a pretty big indicator that maybe they're closer to the defense they were against Kentucky than they were to the defense prior to the bye week. Maybe that's their true form. Dylan, if they go into Knoxville and win this weekend, though, it's going to be because Diego Pavia puts on a show. And we go back to the summer where he wanted to talk about how Vanderbilt should run the state of Tennessee and how he believed that was true. Time for all that to show up, and this is what Vanderbilt's worked for, right, Dylan? I mean, they're 8-2. They've put together this resume, and the only way to catapult it into one that could be a college football playoff resume is to go win on Saturday against Tennessee. Clark Lee has never done it as Vanderbilt's head coach. I feel like this core has basically done everything it can do except for beating Tennessee and making the college football playoff. This is their chance to really tick off the last part of their resume as Vanderbilt football players. I think both of the boxes could possibly be checked with a win on Saturday, but man, Dylan, you got to feel like it's one of the biggest games in program history. And I would probably venture to say that it's the biggest game in program history just because of how much is at stake and everything that could still be ahead of this Vanderbilt team and what it would signify if they go beat Tennessee.
Yeah, Joey, I would agree, and I think that for Vanderbilt to even be in the position to play that, this was what, as a Vanderbilt fan, you dream of heading into the season. And I think most fans, including us, thought that or most people, including us, thought that there wasn't really, if Vanderbilt went 10-2, they would definitely be into the playoff, which is,
Mhm.
not necessarily the case anymore. But nonetheless, to be able to not only play meaningful games throughout, October and November, but be able to conclude your season, after Thanksgiving in Knoxville and have it be a game of this magnitude is something that, is so special and meaningful to I think Vanderbilt and Vanderbilt fans as well. Because like you said, this game. to put the pressure on the committee, and I'm sure we'll talk through this a little bit, but to put that pressure on the committee, to have any chance, you have to go win this game, and frankly, you probably have to do it convincingly, unless a bunch of other things go right. I mean, this is a game where every inch will end up mattering, and I think I mentioned that it's probably going to be a shootout. I think I was just looking. I think the over/under is like 64 and a half or something, which
Mhm.
makes sense, based on the way Tennessee and Vanderbilt have both played this year. And, Vanderbilt's defense improved last year, but I genuinely do think there's a world where the difference could be whether, of course, if Vanderbilt loses, they're out. But I do think there's a world where the difference could be like, did Vanderbilt win 40 to 35 or did Vanderbilt win 40 to 18?
Mhm.
And of course, neither of those things is guaranteed to happen, and Vanderbilt could lose by that margin as well. But I think that puts a ton of pressure on the defense to, not just conform to the game flow and Tennessee's style of play, which is going to be very fast paced. Joey Aguilar will launch the ball down the field, kind of sling it all over the place, and it'll work, and they'll be able to move the ball. He'll also probably put the ball in harm's way a few times. So I think in that sense, it's on the defense to step up because the offense, like we've talked about, we pretty much know what we're getting with the offense right now, and it's going to be a pretty strong output. It's just a matter of can the defense hold Joey, and then obviously can a few other things go right for Vanderbilt as well.
For sure. I went on the Tennessee on Three podcast last night and was asked, what does Vanderbilt have to have happen to win this game? I just pretty vaguely said, like, the margin for error for Vanderbilt has to be a little bit bigger, and they have to be able to create that for themselves. So that involves, can Trey Richardson have a 70-yard touchdown reception again? Can Vanderbilt force a turnover like it did with Colby Taylor getting the interception or Martel Height getting the interceptions against Kentucky? I think the blueprint kind of has to look like that in a lot of ways. Like they've got to be sharp, and they've also got to buy themselves some room for error because I do think Tennessee's probably still more talented than they are, and it's at Neyland Stadium. This game has to look like this year's Vanderbilt team. It can't look like last year's Vanderbilt team where they've got to be perfect to go win the game because frankly, Dylan, like if they have some margin for error, they could run up the score a little bit here. And I know they're 3.5 point underdogs, but I'm not completely counting them out of winning this game by 10 or 15. I don't think anybody who has seen this team should, but man, this is a huge game in a lot of ways. And I wrote it in the column that's going to come out today. I looked at it and I'm thinking back to when Clark Lee was last in Knoxville and he took the podium there. It was just completely dejected. We were basically asking him, what are you going to do to fix this? And in the following weeks, he let go of Joey Lynch. He took over the defense and had probably some of the hardest days as Vanderbilt football's head coach. This is what he built for. This is the type of game that he always wanted to play in. This is what he had in mind. And interesting to see it come to fruition. Dylan, I think we've got to be cognizant of the idea that, I mean, this is a huge, huge game. This is like no other game that this program has really ever played. And almost jarring to look back at that press conference where we were all basically pressing Clark Lee about what are you going to do to get this thing back on the tracks. Now it's back on the tracks, and I don't even know if he could have drawn it up this well back then when he was at that podium.
Yeah, and Vanderbilt, it's come a really long way, and I think this isn't what fans are going to want to hear. But even if you don't sneak into the playoff, even if Vanderbilt goes in and wins, and you don't get the wins you need from Auburn or from LSU or from another team, and you end up as a high stakes bowl game that you can go win on a neutral site.
Mhm.
Even that is a massive, massive step in the right direction. And I don't think anybody's gonna look at Vanderbilt and question them or question it for a long time after that, especially if, you know, the Jared Curtis news gets solidified, which we won't talk too much about. But I do think that even in that scenario, even in a scenario where Vanderbilt drops the game, and they go 9-3, again, have a pretty strong bowl game that's exciting, and they can go out there and maybe even win a bowl game and a high stakes one. That in and of itself is a massive, step in the right direction. To your point, Joey, from 2 years ago, and even from last year, and it's setting this program up for the success it needs. And with all that being said, that's not what the Commodores are thinking about right now. It's about how can we win this game? What can we do to get in to the playoff? And I think it's doable. I think it's despite the fact that literally every game outside of Vanderbilt, Kentucky went against Vanderbilt for its case. To make the playoff with the committee, I think that the all 14 of the top 14 teams won in the CFP rankings, and despite that, they're not in an awful spot where I think I've had a lot of people text me and ask me like what do they need to like what needs to happen for Vanderbilt to get in, and it's not that far fetched.
Mhm.
You need looking at the odds, which are not everything, but you need Vanderbilt to win, and you probably need one other game to go your way to give yourself a shot. And that's most likely Auburn beating Alabama in the Iron Bowl, but there's a few other things that can happen as well. There's there's Oklahoma LSU, there's Ole Miss Mississippi State, which I don't think it's a
Mhm.
slam dunk that if Ole Miss loses they'd be out, but I think
Mhm.
there's a solid chance there. I mean, Notre Dame,
Especially if Kiffin is not the coach
right,
come playoff
exactly.
time.
Yeah, Notre Dame's probably not going to lose to whoever, I think Stanford or something they play. And,
Yeah.
Oregon as well, they could drop a game, and that makes things interesting. I think they play Washington. There's a lot of chaos that can happen, and it's college football. And that brings me back to the point that Vanderbilt just needs to go out and win this game and win it as convincingly as they possibly can. Because even if they get one of those wins, say Auburn, takes down Bama in the Iron Bowl, they're going to need to jump BYU. They're going to need to jump Miami. They're going to need to jump Utah. And I think all that is doable, Joey, with the right win. And if the committee has certain things on their mind and, Vanderbilt's proven itself, come along late in the season, had a really tough SEC schedule, won through some hard fought games, have a Heisman Trophy candidate, which, by the way, Diego Pavia is. And I don't think it's that far fetched to say that he has a good chance to win it with a performance on Saturday against Tennessee. But there's a lot of things there's a lot of things, a lot of moving parts here, a lot of things that could happen, and I think Vanderbilt has a maybe a better shot than people are giving it credit for with a win, Joey.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think the big thing for me is what happens tomorrow night, Tuesday night, in the College Football Playoff Committee rankings. Utah and Miami, two teams to watch here, the two teams ahead of Vanderbilt. I don't know that I was super impressed with Utah on Saturday. I think that could certainly be a team that Vanderbilt jumps, but again, like everyone won ahead of Vanderbilt. They didn't get anything go their way this weekend. I think that's a big problem. Um, but again, like how does the committee evaluate them versus two teams that weren't all that impressive over the weekend, right? Like I don't know that either of those teams really have a better case today than they did last week. I think Vanderbilt does have a better case than it did last week. So I wonder if that's part of the odds too, that something could happen tomorrow night that maybe catapults Vanderbilt into a better position. Like you said, if that's the case, they really only need one or two things to happen. If they're still at 14, I think there might be some uphill climbing left to do here, and they might need to get a few things to go their way. But man, this is a heck of a week for Vanderbilt football where we're going to learn a lot about their college football playoff resume. Again, we talked about the progress they've made. They never said, "Oh, we want progress." They said, "We want to play in January. We think we compete for a national title." That's what Vanderbilt's setting out for right now, and I think that's how we cover this team moving forward because that's the goal that they've set. That's everything that they've worked for to this point. So Dylan, they've got to go take care of their business and do it somewhat convincingly, maybe to jump a team or two that is still ahead of them. But like we talked about, they do have to get. I think the Iron Bowl is really the one to watch.
Yeah.
I think if Auburn beats Alabama, which as crazy as it is to say, it doesn't feel like a non-zero chance. I think Auburn has maybe found something a little bit, and obviously you never know what happens in that rivalry. But still, you're betting on Vanderbilt getting some help in a game from an underdog, so you can never really fully rely on that. But certainly interesting. It's all null if Vanderbilt doesn't win this weekend, but if it wins, I think we're all going to be scoreboard watching this weekend.
Yeah.
Another thing to scoreboard watch a little bit too. Dylan, you can go back to the playoff if you want, but want to bring up Diego Pavia's Heisman odds. Saw
Yeah.
on three put out a thing this morning. He was second in their Heisman ranking. I think a trip to New York could be kind of in the cards there if Vanderbilt wins this weekend. If it loses, I think there's still a chance. I don't think that chance is all that great if they lose still, but I mean, Diego Pavia's body of work is tremendous at this point and might speak for itself even if they lose on Saturday.
Yeah, I'll talk on both those points really quick. I think the first is with the CFP, the fact that they're still 14th. They might jump Utah this week, they might not. That's why I keep talking about how they win in Tennessee because I think the narrative around this team, and if we're being honest, narratives do matter usually with the committee.
Hmm.
The narrative around this team, if they beat Kentucky, 45 to 17, it was basically 45 to 3 before garbage time. It was a complete, pummeling of
Hmm.
Kentucky, and then they can go into Knoxville and win convincingly against a Tennessee team that's ranked pretty. They're ranked. They just beat who did they just beat? Florida. They just beat
Hmm.
Florida.
Yeah, by 20.
Yeah, really convincingly. That's that's going to be something that I think can be the difference between can Vanderbilt jump the Miami, Utahs, and BYUs because that if you're looking for those teams realistically aren't losing next week. They all have pretty easy matchups and Vanderbilt's gonna have to jump them another way, and it's still not their main obstacle considering they need, like you said, Joey, one of someone in that top 10 to drop, which I think we agree the most likely one is Bama. If I think they're maybe 3.5 point favorites last I
Hmm.
checked to Auburn. So that's the main obstacle, but they still need a performance that is, indicative enough and is strong enough to leap the BYUs, the Miamis, the Utahs, and you know that's why like if nobody in that top 10 loses, it's pretty much impossible. Like Vanderbilt could win by 60 and it probably wouldn't matter, which is crazy to say. And,
Right.
it's just how the bracket is shaken up right now. But if they get one of those, not only is winning in Knoxville going to matter, but how they win is really going to matter. So, I think, and it just, you never know how much weight the committee put. There was a lot of talk this week. The announcers are talking about it with the BYU game when they scored late. Like,
Hmm.
no one really knows how much the committee weights, how much you win by and the margin of victory. But it couldn't hurt to go out and run up the score against Tennessee. And of course, as we've talked about, they could very well get the score run up on them. And they're still underdogs in this game. And Tennessee's a good football team, and they have a really good offense. So I don't want to jump the gun too much and say that
Hmm.
they should just blow them out by 40 because winning is certainly not a sure thing or
Yeah.
anything close to it. So, but that does matter, and I think that's just as important as winning, and just as important as getting an Auburn or whatever win. If they win this, if Vanderbilt wins in a very close kind of sloppy game, I think it's going to be really hard to jump the teams ahead of it, especially BYU. But going back to this week's rankings, I think um, jumping Utah could happen. I think again, beating Tennessee is ultimately going to be the thing that would catapult them. So I wouldn't worry too much about it, but definitely still important to keep an eye on. And then I'll touch briefly on the Pavia situation. Yeah, I mean, he needed a game like this if he wanted a shot. Because
Hmm.
he, definitely on the outside looking in, and now I think Joey he does have a really good shot. And last I checked, he's about tied for second in those Vegas odds with Julian saying and Jeremiah Love. Obviously, Fernando Mendoza is the favorite, but I've been saying I think that performance gave him a real chance to go win this thing. And the Heisman's weird because like it's not like the CFP where we get rankings every week and like we know
Hmm.
exactly what the Heisman voters are thinking. Like we really don't know. And Pavia, if you look at the stats and you look at everything, and there's been a lot on Twitter about the numbers, like he's right there, if not
Hmm.
ahead of Mendoza
Which
and
is crazy based off his early season numbers, because his
yeah.
early season numbers wouldn't have had him in the mix or even close.
Absolutely. I mean, it's and he's done that with 500 yards and 6 touchdowns against an SEC team and through basically 3 quarters like that'll do it. But he probably needs a win against Tennessee and he needs a really good performance, which I think is very possible considering the over under is so high in this game. But I'll tell you, Joey, if he goes out there and throws for 400 yards and 4 touchdowns and runs the ball and Vanderbilt wins at Tennessee. I think he could. I mean, this is going to be crazy to say, but I think he could be the favorite or close to it at the end of this week, depending on what Fernando Mendoza does. Because Mendoza right now is the favorite, but I don't think he's necessarily a slam dunk. Like, there's nothing you could do to catch him. And I think between Vanderbilt's storylines and every all the talk about how maybe Pavia is the heart and soul of this team. And when you talk about Heisman and you talk about MVP, who's more valuable to their program than Diego Pavia is to Vanderbilt? Between that and the stats, and then ultimately, if he goes in and beats Tennessee and Knoxville and gives Vanderbilt a chance at the playoff, like I wouldn't be shocked if he goes and wins this thing, Joey, which is crazy, but it's true.
That is that is crazy to say. I mean, some insight here. Like we were talking about, is Dylan going to go to New York for the Heisman ceremony on December 13th? We hadn't even thought that far ahead up until this point. But I mean, those are the things that you have to think about covering Vanderbilt these days. It's like, all right, so how do we plan if Vanderbilt's in the playoff? How do we plan if Diego Pavi's in the Heisman conversation? It's unbelievable to think about these things these days. Dylan, it's going to be a really interesting shootout this weekend.
Yeah.
We'll go back to Tennessee for a sec before we get out of here, but Joey Aguilar, I think, has a little more variability than Pavia in terms of the interception issues. I think they have a lot of talent on the perimeter. I think it's going to be difficult for Vanderbilt's secondary. I think it's pass rush. He's got to get home, but again, it's a good offensive line that Vanderbilt's facing too. It's going to be a challenge for Vanderbilt's defense. But again, it almost feels like a shootout, and weird to think that Vanderbilt might be equipped to win a shootout in Knoxville. Everything Vanderbilt's worked for this weekend in Knoxville, it's got to leave everything out there, and if it can win, everything's still on the table.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to me the key with Tennessee is how can the secondary play? And I think it kind of works to Vanderbilt's advantage because like you mentioned, Aguilar is very volatile and he will go, and put the ball in harm's way, but can somebody actually make a play and capitalize on it like they did this past week? If Vanderbilt forces two or three turnovers this game and the
Mhm.
offense continues to play the way they have, like it almost like shouldn't even matter what Tennessee does on the rest of its drives. And um I think the key is how can you limit those soft spots in the defense that we've seen. Vanderbilt's actually, we haven't talked about this much, but they've actually done a really good job of not getting beaten over the top for the most part,
Yeah,
by
right.
CJ Hurd and Marlon Sewell. Like, if you try to think in your head about like the amount of really like bombs that have Vanderbilt's given up, like it's not that many in my head at least. And but it's about what's the game plan? How can we cover the middle of the field and not leave Tennessee's, receivers open for these chunk plays because Aguilar does kind of live in that, 15-yard down the field range. And I think that'll be the key. And it'll be interesting to see, when Steve Gregory and Clark Lee go into the film room, watch what worked last week, watch what didn't work the week before, see what kind of adjustments they can make, whether it's personnel or it's are we going to blitz more? Because even against Kentucky, the pass rush was they got a few sacks. So I think
Mhm.
Marlon Sewell had a sack, and um, maybe they had a couple more, but they're still not a relentless pass rush. So it's going to be, I think,
Right.
about how can we devise a coverage plan that will maybe fool Aguilar enough to force him into a few turnovers and of course continue to not get beat by the true deep ball over the top with Hurd and Sewell.
For sure. Offensively too, I feel like they've kind of embraced the idea that they're in some shootouts here. Like they've gone up tempo pretty significantly more than they have in the past. It doesn't feel like it's all about ball control anymore. Like they feel more confident in Diego Pavia's deep ball ability and just their ability to push the ball down the field through the air more than I think they have in the past. Even before the bye week, I don't know that they had done it all that much. I know they did against Auburn a little bit, but I just think they're embracing kind of what they are at this point, and I think they're okay if they give up more than 30 points to Tennessee. I think they still feel like they've got a chance in that game, and I think that's really the encouraging sign here if you're a Vanderbilt fan is that Vanderbilt knows what it's going to get with Tennessee. It's not naive enough to think that it can hold it to 15 points or whatever, and it still seems to believe that it has a chance to win. I think that's a big deal, Dylan.
Yeah, absolutely. It's how can Vanderbilt go out there and win this game because this is, like you said in the beginning of the pod, probably the most meaningful game in Vanderbilt football history. If not Vanderbilt sports history, which might be a little bit bold, but
Mhm.
with baseball or and whatnot. But in terms of significance, in terms of impact, in terms of, you know, long-term outlook on not just this program but the school as a whole, I think you can absolutely make the argument this is the biggest game in Vanderbilt sporting history. And the fact that it's in Tennessee in Knoxville only makes it better and more exciting for the guys. And they've been talking about this for months and for weeks. I'm sure they've been thinking about it, like how can we put ourselves to be in this, how can we put ourselves in a position to be in this position, and they've done that. So whether or not they get the help that they need between Auburn and I'm sure we'll have between Auburn and maybe LSU, and I'm sure we'll have some more content coming out on those scenarios, especially on
Mhm.
Tuesday with Graham, our college football playoff odds specialist. But whether or not they
Yourself.
no, that's Graham.
Well, he's the ranking
Oh, the
specialist. I feel like
ranking.
you're the odds
I'm the
specialist.
odds specialist. Okay, we
Mhm.
do a
And
lot of specialization here.
The AP poll expert.
Yeah, Graham did part of the AP poll this week though, because I was on a flight.
Yeah, we're really mixing it up here. And that now it's a blurry line too. Like I'm the basketball AP poll specialist, and I think they're going to be ranked today. So I'm coming for your title here.
A lot of specialization. Oh, you think they're going to be ranked? All right, we won't get into basketball, but
A big
no,
week
but
for basketball,
it
but
is.
we'll talk about that on Wednesday when they actually play.
Yeah, but no, in general though, Vanderbilt being in this position to go out there and win this game and being in this position to, make a statement and give themselves a shot at the playoff, I think is something that fans can't overlook, and that in that building they're not necessarily overlooking that opportunity either, Joey.
Yeah, for sure. I think Vanderbilt believes they can go win that game, and they're gonna have to do some things right to do it. But it's certainly on the table for them. And if they go win that game, everything else is on the table as well. Dylan, two things I'm gonna hit here. Housekeeping. I I'm not sure I expect the Clark Lee extension to be announced this week. I still believe it's going to happen, but the week before the Tennessee game doesn't seem like
Yeah.
maybe the ideal time there. That's not based off a lot of intel. It's just kind of logical at this point. Like I don't know. I think if it was going to happen, it would have been early to mid last week. Now I think it would be too much of a distraction to do that before that game. Jared Curtis feels like is trending toward a flip to Vanderbilt. We'll see about how that actually plays out. It's a high schooler at the end of the day, but all signs are pointing to Vanderbilt really having a strong chance there. We'll have a story about that today and kind of what that would mean for Vanderbilt. But man, Dylan, an exciting time for Vanderbilt sports. And again, this thing could go to another level if Vanderbilt goes and takes care of business in Knoxville.
Yeah, absolutely. And, between the Clark news and the Curtis news, and of course, neither of those are fully set in stone yet, but feels like like you said, it's trending in that direction. And, briefly on Curtis, I think getting him would be monumental for this program. And I know you're putting out this article on it t today because it's true, but, to find a diamond in the rough transfer quarterback from New Mexico State with his offensive coordinator and his tight end is one thing, and that's something that can, set a program on a right track like this has. And I think I talked a little bit about this in the pod Monday, but Clark Lee's, vision has now come to life. The worry inside of, I guess, inside or outside of Vanderbilt is what happens next. If when Diego leaves, when Eli leaves, say Tim Beck gets another job, maybe Jerry Kill leaves, is Vanderbilt still set up for this long term success, or do they go back to the 2-10, doormat of the SEC that they've been?
Mhm.
And getting Curtis to me pretty much eliminates the latter as a possibility. I think obviously he's a great talent, but to get that level of a 5-star quarterback to come in here and probably start as a true freshman, that not only will make the team successful, but it will make Vanderbilt, as appealing of a destination to come to as a recruit as any other in the country between that team having that quarterback and, obviously the city and everything else Vanderbilt and Nashville brings. So it's massive, and I don't want to talk too much about it again because it's not fully set. We don't know for sure if he's going to flip, but obviously, Joey, if he does, the seismic impact of that and what it means for this program and this school and these fans cannot be overstated.
For sure. Dylan, we're kind of in a holding pattern here, a lot to talk about, but not a lot of results yet at this point.
Yeah.
We'll see how this all plays out, but man, potential for an incredible few weeks here. We're really seemingly in the golden era of Vanderbilt football, and again, that golden era could get a lot better if they go and win at Neyland Stadium this weekend. So for Joey Dwyer, for Dylan Tovitz, we'll have you covered with basketball this week, and then Graham and I will be in Knoxville. I'm sure Dylan will have some sort of analysis or coverage of that as well. But man, thank you guys for watching. We'll be with you a lot in the next few weeks. Thank you guys. God bless. Talk soon.